This is a quote from the Financial Times, where they point out that in 2000, when Brazil started to bring the private sector into higher education, they had 1.8 million students in higher education, but by 2010, this had exceeded 6 million students. So that's what I mean when I say you use your strengths, which is the private sector, to solve your weaknesses. This is what the Brazilians do. In fact, I had an experience of how the Brazilians operate, because one of the things that Lula did, Lula da Silva, the president of Brazil, one of the things he introduced in Brazil was African awareness of Brazil and of the Brazilian population. A huge part of the Brazilian population is of African origin, as you know, who went to Brazil as slaves from Angola, from West Africa. So Brazil has a large population of African descent. But for many years, this was not recognized as being an aspect of Brazilian culture, as an aspect of Brazilian heritage. So when the Workers' Party came into power, one of the things that they did was to say that the Brazilian people have to understand that their heritage, that Africa is their heritage, as well as, of course, the European heritage. So they started teaching African history. And one day I was attending a conference in Rio, and I don't know how they found out I was going there. I was asked to come and give a lecture on a Saturday morning to a master's class of teachers who were taking masters in African history. So they were being incentivized, the high school teachers were being incentivized to teach Africa, to acquire more knowledge about the history of Africa. And for that, they would get a master's degree, and therefore their pay would change and so on. So I was asked, and this was on a Saturday morning, and can you imagine South African teachers going to a lecture on a Saturday morning? But this lecture theater was full with the teachers who were improving their skills, improving their knowledge of African history. I was very, very impressed. This was actually the Catholic University in Rio de Janeiro. So it's very, very clear that the Brazilians have this foresight and have this commitment to their country to solve the problems that they identify. Just to give you an illustration of what I mean by the problems of the public sector in South Africa, it is estimated that 15 years ago there were 5,000 engineers in the public sector in South Africa. Today this is down to 1,500. So when you look at the country, the size of South Africa, we have 9 regions. We have huge metropolitan areas like Johannesburg, like Durban, Pinetown, Cape Town, and so on and so forth. And then we have other big towns, Bloemfontein, Kimberley, etc., etc. All of them put together, they only have 1,500 engineers. So you see that the public sector in South Africa is in a very, very poor state. The private sector, on the other hand, as they point out, they have 22,000 consulting people in the consulting engineering sector. So I think this underlines the message that we have to use now, one of the consequences, for example, of this small number of engineers in the public sector is the time it takes for South Africa to commission, for example, a road or to build a school, or because you need engineers and architects and so on in the government sector in order to be able to commission a road, because they have to design the road, they have to undertake the studies on behalf of the government, and then the road has to be, okay, the road may be built by a private sector, but there is a big role that the state engineers have to play. And this is what one of the consequences, therefore, of this is that we have long delays before civil engineering projects are implemented, precisely because of shortage of engineers in the state sector, shortage of town planners. I mean, you only have to look at the way Johannesburg is expanding to the north, and through these, what you call these townhouses, you can tell that this is a city without a serious town planner, because this whole urban sprawl that is happening in Johannesburg. In fact, my company tried to develop a project in the Lanseria area, and so we went to apply for the initial discussion in Randburg, and the guy who was the town planner who we were talking to, now he was nominally working for the municipality. Then he turned around to me and said, well, you know, if you meet with me for dinner this evening, I'm actually the consultant who will move your application through the system. So you can imagine, if that is how our town planning departments work, then you can imagine that there is no town planning. Everything is about who pays whom and what. Now, why are we in the situation that we're in South Africa? This is a very long story. As you know, South Africa as a state, as a modern state, is actually a very old country, probably older than the United States. It was established in the 17th century by the Dutch East India Company. So South Africa actually has a long history of the private sector. The Dutch East India Company was what was called a joint stock company, which is a normal corporation today. So you can see that the very foundation of South Africa was done by the private sector, by a private company, which was called the Dutch East India Company. I won't take you that far. I will just take you to independent South Africa. When South Africa became independent, what has driven South Africa since independence? And our independence is something many people don't. They think our independence was in 1994. Others think our independence was in 1961. Others think our independence was in 1948. So South Africa's independence was actually in 1910. Before 1910, South Africa was a British colony. We were a British colony in various states of control by the British between 1795 and 1910. So South Africa was actually a British colony in the way that Tanzania was a British colony, or Ivory Coast was a French colony, and we have all the characteristics of colonies in Africa.